Hello there, my sleepy fellows. I'm ever so glad you've wandered into this gentle corner of the night. The sky above the Shire is painted in strokes of gold and lavender, the last light of day resting softly on rolling hills. The distant hum of crickets rises and falls like a lullaby, while the scent of evening flowers lingers in the cool air. Smoke curls upward from tiny chimneys, and fireflies dance lazily between garden paths. Tonight, we set out on a quiet journey through time and memory, through forests where whispers hide in the trees, and mountains that remember the footsteps of wizards. Our story weaves through the hidden history of Gandalf the Grey, whose journey began far beyond these peaceful lands. So pull the blanket close, breathe in the stillness, and let your heart slow to the rhythm of twilight. For in the hush between dreams, there are stories waiting, ones that softly unfold like starlight, guiding you ever deeper into the wonders of Middle-earth. And now, let the tale begin, gently, as all good tales should. Before we wander too far down the winding paths of this tale, allow me a moment to gently share what lies ahead. Tonight's story is one of ancient light and quiet power, a tale not just of battles or rings, but of purpose carried across the ages. We will follow the journey of Mithrandir, the Grey Pilgrim, known to most as Gandalf. But his tale does not begin in the Shire, nor even in Middle-earth. No, it begins in the undying lands of Valinor, far across the sea, where the light of the two trees once glowed, and the air shimmered with music older than time itself. You may know him as the kindly wizard with a crooked hat and a long pipe, who nudged hobbits toward courage and kings toward honor. But who was he, truly? Why was he sent? And what mysteries linger in the quiet power he so often kept hidden? This journey is not a tale of noise or haste. It is one of stars and silence, of small kindnesses and great wisdom. We'll walk beside Gandalf in the earliest days of his mission, through the ancient forests of Lindon, along the stone halls of Khazad-dûm, and into the heart of lands that still remember the echoes of the Valor's whispers. So, if you're enjoying these peaceful adventures through Middle-earth, I invite you to gently tap that like button or softly subscribe so you won't miss the next tale. And if you feel the pull of stories woven with wonder, I've left more just beyond this one, quiet paths for quiet nights. Now, my sleepy fellows, let's return to the firelight and fall into the next chapter of this soft, starlit journey through time. In a time before hobbits stirred their kettles and dwarves struck fire from deep stone, before even the first age had etched its marks across Arda, there existed a realm untouched by decay or sorrow, the Blessed Realm of Valinor. It was there, in that land of light bait and harmony, that one of the Maya walked beneath the golden branches of Laurelin, learning wisdom and compassion from the Valor themselves. His name was Olorin. Unlike the others of his kind, who often stood tall and radiant, Olorin was gentle in spirit and subtle in his ways. He wandered in gardens and listened more than he spoke. In the halls of Irmo, the master of dreams, he learned the art of comfort and healing. And from Nienna, the Lady of Sorrow, he learned the deep strength found in compassion. Olorin did not seek power or dominion. His strength lay in his patience and in his faith that even the smallest heart could hold a spark bright enough to push back the dark. And so, when the Valar saw the shadow rising again in Middle-earth, long after Morgoth's chains had cooled, they chose 5 of the Maiar to sail eastward and help guide the peoples of that world. Among them was Olorin, cloaked now in the form of an old man and given the name Gandalf the Grey Pilgrim. He arrived not in splendor, but in humility. His robes were simple, his staff plain. His eyes, though, held the memory of starlight from before the shaping of the world. In the early years of his journey through Middle-earth, Gandalf did not gather armies or declare his might. He walked alone, often unseen, through forests, mountains, and ruins. He listened to the songs of birds and the groans of tree roots. He spoke to wandering elves and Hostly men, to dwarves beneath their mountains, and yes, even to curious little hobbits whose hearts held courage greater than their size. This is the story of that wandering wizard, of the strength he never flaunted and the power he rarely showed. It is the tale of how kindness can shape kingdoms, how gentle hands can steady the mightiest blades, and how quiet wisdom can stand firm against the darkest of storms. Tonight, we travel not just through lands and legends, but through time and memory, following Gandalf from the eternal peace of Valinor to the wild, whispering winds of Middle-earth. Now, my sleepy fellows, let us step softly into the heart of his journey and listen to the earth as it begins to stir beneath his feet. Though Gandalf's journey began in the shimmering lands of Valinor, it was in Middle-earth that his days grew deep with meaning, and so, for many long years after his arrival, he walked softly among its people, never announcing his purpose, never demanding a throne or title. Instead, he became a traveler, a quiet figure with a long gray cloak and a weathered hat, always leaning slightly on his staff and smiling more with his eyes than his lips. At dawn, he would often be seen wandering near the edges of elven woods or speaking softly to the horses of Rohan. Birds seemed to linger where he passed, perching on branches near his shoulder as if listening for stories. In towns and villages, he would sit near the fire and listen to the folk, never pressing for secrets, but always paying close attention to even the smallest fears or wonders shared over mugs of ale. He traveled frequently to the Shire, drawn to the simple warmth and quiet of hobbit life. In those green lands of gently rolling hills and wildflower meadows, Gandalf was not feared as a wizard, but welcomed as an odd but friendly visitor. The children loved him, especially when he came with fireworks tucked away in his cloak, bursts of stars shaped like dragons, trees that bloomed with light, and soaring birds made of flame that vanished with a soft pop. But even in those cheerful visits, Gandalf was always listening. The land, the wind, the roots below the ground, he heard them speak in ways most could not. It was not loud or clear, rather, it was like the softest hum beneath the silence. And Gandalf knew Middle-earth was beginning to stir again, not with the brightness of spring, but with the breath of a coming storm. One evening, long after the hobbits had gone to sleep and the hearths were cooling into coals, Gandalf stood at the edge of a quiet field just beyond Hobbiton. The moon was high and round, casting a silver glow on the tall grasses swaying in the breeze. He closed his eyes and felt it, a faint, unnatural stillness on the wind, the kind that settled too suddenly, too completely. Even the crickets had gone quiet. He knelt and touched the earth with his fingers. It was warmer than it should have been. Not hot, not burning, just odd. And somewhere far off, so faint he wasn't sure if it came from without or within, he heard something like a deep hum. It was not musical. It was not speech. It was ancient, and it had no beginning. The next morning, Gandalf rose early and took a long walk through the woods near the Brandywine River. He passed familiar trees, greeting each in his own quiet way. But today, they seemed a little less cheerful. The leaves trembled even though there was no wind, and the birds stayed hidden in the canopy. He noticed a patch of flowers, small, blue, star-shaped blossoms that only grew in summer sun. Yet now, in early spring, they bloomed under heavy shade, nestled at the base of a gnarled oak. Gandalf knelt beside them and frowned slightly. "These should not be here yet," he murmured to himself, "not unless—" But he did not finish the thought. He gently pressed his staff into the earth beside the flowers, watching them sway and shimmer ever so faintly, as though touched by something unseen. He whispered a few words in an ancient tongue, and for just a moment, the air around him felt heavier, almost reverent, like stepping into a forgotten temple. That evening, he lit a small fire near a moss-covered stone and drew out a folded piece of parchment. It was old, very old, and marked with symbols few could still read. Gandalf traced one with his finger, a spiral within a circle with 3 stars above it. It was a sign from long ago, one that appeared only in stories whispered by the oldest of the elves. He remembered a tale he'd once heard in Lorien, when the Malern trees had just begun to bloom, of a hidden presence buried deep in the bones of Middle-earth, older even than Sauron, slumbering in silence, dreaming across the ages. He had not thought of that tale in years, but now the land itself was remembering. Days passed, and Gandalf found himself drawn further eastward. The roads were familiar, yet something had changed. Shadows clung a little longer to the edges of paths, and stones he had once passed without thought now seemed to hum beneath his feet. Not dark, not yet, but alert, as if the land was waiting. One night, while camping in the shadow of the misty mountains, he heard the distant howl of wolves. That was not unusual, but what followed was silence. Not just quiet, but complete absence of sound, as though the world itself held its breath. Then, softly, a breeze brushed his cheek, but it did not smell of pine or cold mountain air. It carried the scent of starlight and memory, of ancient halls beneath the sea and lanterns that had long gone out. He sat very still. Somewhere, a bell tolled, but there were no bells in the mountains. He looked up and saw nothing, just the sky, scattered with stars. Yet something unseen had passed overhead, a presence light as breath, old as the dawn. Gandalf said nothing. He only placed his hand over his heart and bowed his head slightly. This was no longer a simple wandering. The threads of mystery had begun to weave themselves into his path. The world was stirring, and the Grey Pilgrim knew that the time had come to remember not just the tales of the First Age, but the powers that lay buried beneath the names, beneath even his own, for he had been sent not merely to walk and watch, but to awaken what must never be forgotten. It was near twilight when Gandalf found himself in a secluded glade between the roots of the misty mountains and the edge of ancient Fangorn forest. The light of the fading day draped itself across mossy stones like silk, and the air was thick with the soft scent of damp earth and cedar. This place, though untouched by foot or voice for many seasons, welcomed him with a silence that felt neither empty nor still, but expectant. He had followed a path that hadn't been there the day before, a faint trail, visible only when the sun slanted a certain way through the branches. It shimmered slightly underfoot, not with brilliance, but with a kind of hush, as if time itself passed more gently in this forgotten fold of forest. As he walked, Gandalf noticed the first signs. Fireflies dancing in strange formations, not scattered like stars, but weaving circles and lines in the air, glowing with soft golden blue light. They moved not with the whim of nature, but with purpose, as though remembering an ancient ritual. He paused and raised his staff slightly, not as a weapon, but in greeting. Namaria, he whispered, using the elvish word for farewell, but also, at times, for reverence. The fireflies answered not with words, but with movement. They gathered near a hollow tree, then scattered, revealing something half buried beneath the roots. Gandalf stepped forward and gently brushed away the moss and soil, revealing a stone tablet. It was no larger than a hobbit's dinner plate, and its surface bore a carving so faint it could have been mistaken for the veins of the stone, except that they shimmered when touched by the moonlight. He traced the markings with a fingertip. The lines formed a rune he had seen once before in a scroll locked within the archives of Valinor, so ancient it had nearly turned to dust when he first read it. It was a sign of the Olorin, his own name, in its oldest form. The air shifted, as though a door had opened somewhere far away. He stood and looked around, but there was no danger, only stillness, only awe. Just beyond the glade, a soft sound floated on the breeze, a melody played not on any instrument known to men or elves, but woven through the rustling leaves and the distant trickle of water. It was a lullaby of the earth, a song sung not for ears, but for memory. Gandalf followed it. The path narrowed, bending through thick undergrowth that parted of its own accord, revealing a clearing ringed with ancient stones. At its center stood a single tree, wide and low, with silver leaves that reflected starlight even in the dusk. Beneath it lay a pool, still as glass, catching the glow of the sky and holding it gently. He approached the pool and knelt beside it. In its reflection, he did not see himself, not entirely. Instead, he saw glimpses of another time, of white shores beneath an eternal sun, of tall towers built not by hands, but by will and light. He saw his arrival upon Middle-earth's western shores, cloaked in the form of an old man, though his soul still hummed with the power of the Maya. And he saw 5 figures standing together, the Istari, himself, Saruman, Radagast, and the 2 blue wizards, long vanished into the east. The memory faded, but its warmth lingered. The pool rippled once, then settled, returning to stillness. A soft breeze brushed his shoulder, carrying with it a whisper, not a voice, but a feeling. The land was trying to remember him. Later that night, Gandalf sat near his fire at the forest's edge. The flames crackled softly, their warmth not just of heat, but of comfort. The stars above blinked in and out from behind clouds like slow, ancient signals, and the forest spoke in its own way, branches creaking, leaves stirring, owls calling. He reached into his satchel and pulled out a fragment of an old staff. It had belonged to one of the blue wizards, Alatar, if memory served, who had vanished into the east long ago. No word had come back, but Gandalf had always sensed their journey hadn't ended in silence. Something moved in the east, something that stirred even now. He turned the fragment over in his hands. Though worn and cracked, it still hummed with the echo of power. Faint, yes, but unmistakable. "Where did you go, old friend?" he murmured. In response, the flames danced higher for a brief moment, flaring with a soft hue of indigo and silver. Gandalf smiled. The magic was not gone, not entirely. The next day, he traveled southward into lands few dared wander. The paths here were not marked, but his steps were sure. Animals crossed his path, but never startled. Even the breeze seemed to part before him. In one valley, he discovered a field of white flowers that bloomed only at night. Moon petals, the elves called them. They glowed faintly under starlight and were said to grow where great sorrow once rested, but also where hope had quietly endured. Gandalf knelt and plucked one bloom gently. As he held it in his hand, the petals shimmered and an image came to him, not through vision, but feeling. A memory of Lorien, of Galadriel's garden, where he had once sat in silence as the lady looked beyond the veil of time. She had said, "The world forgets the gentle hands of those who shape it with care, but the land remembers, and so do I." He tucked the flower into his satchel. His journey was no longer just about observation. It was becoming a path of remembrance, not only for himself, but for the land, for those who had once guided it, and for the stories that must never be lost. That evening, as the sun dipped low behind the hills, Gandalf reached a cliff overlooking a small lake, ringed with trees that seemed to lean inward, as if listening to the water's whispers. He sat beneath an old beech tree and closed his eyes. Behind his lids, the light of Valinor flickered like a distant flame. He felt again the call of the Valor, not in words, but in presence. The soft urging that had sent him into Middle-earth, not to rule, not to dominate, but to guide with patience, humility, and quiet strength. And now it stirred again. Something had awakened, and whatever it was, it had begun to pull at the threads of memory, magic, and time. Gandalf opened his eyes and looked out at the lake, calm and undisturbed. The wind whispered gently, and somewhere in the distance an owl sang to the moon. The journey had only just begun. The morning came quietly, painted in pale silver as mists rolled slowly through the hills. Dewdrops clung to every blade of grass, catching the early light like tiny stars. Gandalf stood on a rise just above a hollow glen where the world seemed unusually still, as if waiting for something. He breathed in deeply, the scent of pine and cold stone mixing with the faint sweetness of blooming heather. Beneath his feet, the path had vanished. There were no more signposts, no trails marked on maps, only a sense that the earth itself was guiding him now. He moved slowly, his staff tapping gently against the soil. The rhythm of his footsteps became like a soft heartbeat in the hush of the morning. Birdsong had quieted, even the wind held its breath. Ahead, nestled between two great stones that jutted like ancient guardians, was a circle of moss-covered earth. Within it, a single white tree stood, its bark gleaming faintly, its branches bare save for a single bloom of radiant silver. It was unlike any tree he had seen in Middle-earth. He stepped closer. As he did, the tree shimmered, not with light, but with memory. Its form blurred and shifted as though layers of time were rising to the surface. For a moment, he saw it not as a small, solitary tree in a forgotten glen, but as a sapling grown from the remnants of something older, something that had once stood in the gardens of Valinor in the light of the two trees. Gandalf's breath caught in his throat. He reached out a hand and laid his palm gently against the bark. The sensation was not cold, nor warm. It was timeless. And then, without warning, his surroundings began to change. Not with violence, not with fear, but with quiet unraveling, as if a veil had been drawn aside. The moss beneath his feet faded into smooth white stone. The trees fell away, replaced by pillars of crystal and starlight. He stood now not in Middle-earth, but in an echo of the past, some lingering vision of Valinor etched into the fabric of the tree itself. Before him stood a figure, tall and robed in light that shifted between silver and blue. The being regarded him with eyes deep and ancient, not threatening, never threatening, but weighty with knowledge. Olorin, the name echoed in Gandalf's mind, for that was his true name in the West. The figure was not separate from him, but rather a memory of who he had been, a reflection of himself before the gray cloak, before the staff, before the smoke rings and long roads. "Do you remember?" the voice asked, not spoken aloud, but carried through thought, as if the tree itself were reaching into his soul. Gandalf closed his eyes. He remembered walking the gardens of Irmo in Lorien, listening to the music of the Ainur, watching the stars take shape for the first time. He remembered humility, wonder, and the deep sorrow of leaving that place to walk among mortals, not as a lord, but as a guide. "I remember," he whispered. The vision faded gently, like mist lifting under morning sun. He stood once more in the glen, his hand still resting on the white tree, now still and silent. Yet the connection remained, pulsing like a quiet thread of light from the bark to his heart. He stepped back. The single bloom at the top of the tree opened slightly, revealing a glimmering silver fruit no larger than a marble. It shimmered faintly, as though the stars themselves had placed a fragment of their light within it. Gandalf reached out and cupped it in his palm. It was warm, and in that warmth he felt something awaken, not a command, not a task, but a calling. He placed the fruit within a soft cloth pouch and tucked it into the folds of his robe. He did not know what it meant, not yet, but he knew it must not be lost. It was not merely a relic. It was a piece of the world's memory, a whisper from the west that must one day speak again. The wind stirred at his back. He turned and looked beyond the glen. The path was still gone, but his feet knew where to walk. Somewhere out there, among hills and forests and forgotten ruins, were more pieces of the puzzle, more echoes waiting to awaken. As he walked, his thoughts drifted back to the Istari, his brethren who had come with him long ago. Saruman the White, who had once been the most learned, now lost in pride and ambition. Radagast the Brown, gentle soul and friend to birds, who wandered the woodlands and spoke more to beasts than to men. And the two blue wizards, Alatar and Palando, who had vanished into the east with quiet purpose, leaving behind only speculation and half-remembered names. Were they still out there? Had they too found pieces of the old light? He remembered the last time he had seen them, gathered together in the halls of the Valor, receiving their purpose, cloaked in humility and shadow, given not command, but quiet counsel. "Do not seek to rule," Manwë had said. "Seek to understand, to guide, for power shall not be your strength, but patience shall be your might." And he had carried those words with him ever since. The day wore on, and Gandalf made camp by a slow river. He brewed tea from herbs gathered nearby, and sat watching the ripples play with reflections of the sky. He didn't write in his journal, nor sketch the tree he'd seen. Some things were not meant for parchment. Some memories were living things, meant to be carried in silence. That night, the stars were sharp and clear, strewn across the heavens like scattered jewels. And just as he closed his eyes to rest, he saw, far off in the northern sky, a faint streak of silver fire. A shooting star. But Gandalf knew better. It was not a falling star. It was a sign, a whisper from beyond the sky. The mystery had truly begun. And as he drifted into sleep beside the embers of his fire, a soft smile touched his lips. The land remembered, and so did he. The dawn came not in splendor, but in hush. Pale light filtered through low clouds, and the world seemed suspended in a moment between waking and dream. Gandalf stirred from sleep beneath the shelter of a moss-covered tree, his staff resting across his lap, the small silver fruit from the white tree still safely hidden in his robes. He did not rise immediately. Instead, he sat still, his eyes on the gentle bend of the river before him. The water flowed with a whisper, catching small flecks of light that danced and shifted like memories. A heron lifted quietly from the reeds, gliding into the soft sky without a sound. It was here, in this lull between motion and meaning, that his thoughts began to bloom. He had not spoken aloud the name Olorin in many years. It had been long since he allowed himself to dwell upon the shores of Valinor, or the harmony of the Ainur, or the gardens of Irmo, where dreams drifted like falling leaves. But the memory of the tree, of that singular bloom, of the soft, glowing fruit, had unlocked something in him. Not urgency, not dread, but a quiet ache, a longing not for power, nor clarity, but for remembrance. He drew a long breath, letting the cool morning air fill his lungs, and exhaled slowly as he stared into the water. "Why now?" he murmured, almost to the river itself. "Why show me this now, after all these roads, all these burdens?" There was no answer in words, but the rustle of wind in the branches seemed to stir a memory. He had not come to Middle-earth to lead armies or wield dominion. He had come in the guise of an old man to be among the free peoples, quietly, gently guiding, never revealing all, never forcing fate. He had come to remind them of hope, but somewhere, perhaps even he had forgotten that he too needed reminding, not of his mission, but of his beginning, of why he had chosen this path in the first place. The fire at his small camp had burned down to glowing coals. Gandalf reached out and stirred it with a stick, watching tiny embers rise into the air. The flames were warm, but soft, contained, a reflection of the power he carried, a power not meant to dazzle, but to illuminate quietly. He remembered the other wizards, the Istari. Saruman, once his peer in wisdom, had sought mastery instead of guidance. Radagast had fled into the safety of nature, and the blue wizards, mysteries still, had wandered into lands far beyond knowledge. And yet here he was, still walking, still watching, still listening, not because he must, but because he cared. In the silence of the forest, he took out the silver fruit once more and held it in his palm. Its light was not bright, but it pulsed gently, like a heartbeat, as though the memory of the West still lived within it. He gazed at it for a long while, and in doing so, he saw not answers, but clarity. This journey was not about knowledge or mission. It was about wholeness, about reconciling who he had been with who he had become, about remembering that even one as ancient as he could still be surprised, still learn, still wonder. He placed the fruit carefully back into its pouch and tucked it near his heart. The path before him was still unclear. There would be other roads, other signs. But for now, it was enough to have remembered, enough to sit beside the river and feel the world breathe. As he stood, the mist around him began to lift. The trees shimmered faintly in the early light, and somewhere far off, the cry of an eagle echoed through the skies. He turned westward, not because a map told him to, but because something in him knew that was where the next answer would lie, not in battles, nor in towers, but in quiet places, among ancient stones and whispered songs. He walked without haste. Along the path, the moss felt softer beneath his feet. The breeze that played through the trees carried the faintest trace of song, as though the land itself remembered him and welcomed him home. That night he rested near a glade filled with soft white flowers that opened only in moonlight. He sat with his back to a tree, his pipe unlit for once, and watched the stars appear one by one. He thought of the Shire, of Bilbo and Frodo, of warm hearths and cheerful voices, of fields that never knew war. He smiled softly, knowing his presence there had been just a thread in a much greater weave, but a necessary one. Perhaps that was the nature of all his work, not to be the hero of songs, but the hand that steadied, the whisper that encouraged, the light in dark corners. And now the road called him again, not to save, but to remember, not to teach, but to witness, to walk once more in places forgotten, and in so doing, to become whole. The stars were high, pale and watchful, when Gandalf crossed a quiet stream and entered the hollow known as Ellenrim's Hollow, a place seldom marked on maps, yet remembered by those who listened to the wind or studied the constellations. It was said to be a resting place for wanderers with old memories and older names. Here, the land opened wide into a field ringed by tall birches that hummed faintly when the breeze moved through their leaves. Gandalf, sensing the hush of something sacred, walked slowly into the glade. The air felt like silver silk, cool, soft, and expectant. Near a small fire ringed with smooth stones, a tall figure in a twilight gray cloak stood waiting. The figure turned slowly as Gandalf approached, and the wizard recognized him at once. "Dear," Gandalf said, his voice soft as the breeze. "It has been a long age." The elf inclined his head, a faint smile at the corners of his mouth. His golden hair shimmered with starlight, and his eyes held the calm of one who had seen both the rising of Anor and the fading of the two trees. "I wondered," Amdir replied, "if you would come this way again. The stars whispered of your return." They said little more at first. Elves had no need for haste in speech. Instead, they sat quietly by the fire, which Amdir rekindled with a murmur in the ancient tongue. Flames sprang to life, not roaring, but dancing gently, their light revealing the worn lines of Gandalf's travel-worn cloak and the silver thread in his beard. "Do you still remember the songs of Aman?" Amdir asked at length. "I remember enough," Gandalf said, staring into the flames, "though I forget how long it's been since I last heard them sung aloud." Amdir took out a reed flute, carved long ago in Lorien, and began to play. The notes curled upward into the night, like wisps of light, soft and steady, stirring memories from the dust of ages. As the melody wound into silence, Gandalf spoke of what he had seen, the silver fruit of the tree, the warm rune in the glade, the stirring in his spirit that had led him here. Amdir listened with quiet eyes. "The world is shifting," the elf said, "not only in ways men can see, but in the unseen cords that tie Middle-earth to the undying lands. You feel it more keenly than most because you are woven into both." "Sometimes," Gandalf murmured, "I wonder if I still belong to either." "You belong to the road," Amdir said gently, "and that is enough." Later that night, as the fire dimmed and the grass cooled with dew, Gandalf lay on his back and watched the stars blink between the birch leaves. He felt the peace of old companionship, not loud, not demanding, but present and real. And for a time, he did not feel alone. The next morning, Amdir was gone. Only a silver leaf remained on Gandalf's cloak, resting quietly beside his heart. He journeyed next through the silent woods near the edge of the White Mountains, where shadows fell long and whispers stirred among the roots. There, near a crumbling cairn that bore no name, he met a second companion. The man was seated on a log, sharpening a long dagger with smooth, measured strokes. His cloak was dark green, his eyes shadowed, but not cold. "Gandalf the Grey," the man said without looking up. "I thought the wind carried an old scent." "Halros," Gandalf said with a low chuckle, "I did not expect to find you haunting barrows and forgotten woods." The Dunedain ranger gave a small, tired smile. "I go where stories grow thin. Someone must remember the places that maps forget." They spoke long into the dusk, trading tales of quiet battles, of orcs routed in forgotten valleys, of ancient ruins watched by silent eyes, of paths walked not for glory, but for duty. Halros had once stood at the borders of Arnor when its strength still lingered. He remembered Gilrain and a boy called Estelle who asked too many questions about kings and stars. "He asks fewer questions now," Gandalf mused. "Because he has become the answer," Halros replied. They shared a meal of simple bread and dried apples. Gandalf offered pipeweed, and Halros accepted with the reverence of one touching memory. "I followed a wisp of light a few nights ago," Halros said, staring into the flames. "It led to an oak that grew over an old altar, long crumbled. There were markings in the stone, not in any tongue I knew." Gandalf listened carefully, then described the rune he had seen glowing in the glade. Halros nodded slowly. "Then you are not the only one being summoned." "No," Gandalf said, eyes distant. "The land is speaking again." In the morning, they parted without ceremony. Rangers had little use for goodbyes. But as Gandalf passed beneath the swaying ranches, he felt steadier. The road ahead, though still unclear, was not empty. A third encounter came days later on the edge of a moor, beneath a pale sky that touched with blue-gray clouds. A figure crouched near a pool, murmuring softly to a fox. The creature did not flee, but listened. As Gandalf drew closer, the figure rose, a woman cloaked in robes the color of frost. Her eyes shimmered with ancient light, and though she bore no staff, the air around her thrummed with power. "You're far from the White City," Gandalf said, tilting his head. "And you," she replied, "are far from the stars." He smiled. She gave no name, only stories. Stories that she said she had heard from birds and trees and streams. Some of what she told him had not been spoken aloud in thousands of years. She spoke of a hill that no longer stood, upon which once burned a fire that never died. She spoke of a mirror hidden beneath ice, reflecting not faces, but intentions. She spoke of 3 stars that had fallen to Middle-earth and still hummed with the echo of Ilúvatar's song. And Gandalf listened, and he remembered. That night, as he rested beside a pool that glowed faintly from within, he did not dream in words. He dreamt in music, in light, in the feeling of knowing and being known. When he awoke, the road before him seemed to hum faintly, and though the companions had gone, Their wisdom lingered, soft as the starlight, strong as stone. The fire crackled softly, casting flickers of golden light on the faces of those gathered close. Gandalf sat with knees drawn to his chest, his cloak wrapped snugly around his shoulders. The others, Amdir, the elf of Lothlorien, Halros, the Dunedain ranger, and the silver-eyed woman who called herself Elthain, were arranged in a loose circle, cups of warm drink steaming gently in their hands. Above them stretched the open sky, dark and vast, with stars like silver pollen drifting across velvet. A hush hung in the air, not empty, but full of presence, as though the land itself had drawn in its breath to listen. It was Halros who broke the silence first, his voice low, steady, and worn with age. "In the north," he began, eyes on the flames, "they still speak of the Watchers." Amdir tilted his head, listening. "Not spirits," Halros continued, "not quite, not ghosts. They are the echoes of the first guardians, the ones who stood before even the Númenóreans sailed. Some say they linger in the stone foundations of ancient towers, or beneath the roots of old hills. I've seen signs of them, stone circles that whisper when the wind shifts, cairns that point toward stars which no longer shine." Gandalf nodded slowly. "Not all that fades is lost. Some memory roots itself too deeply in the land to be forgotten." Elthain's eyes shone faintly as she leaned forward. "I once stood at the mouth of the White Mountains when the wind carried a song. No words, just a melody, clear and high, that moved like starlight. The shepherds there say the mountains remember when they were young, and that sometimes, if the sky is just right, they sing." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Amdir, who had watched the stars this whole time, began to hum a tune so soft it could have been mistaken for the wind. It was old, older than the Third Age, older even than the sun and moon. His voice rose, barely above a whisper, and the others fell still. The music painted a picture, ships sailing into light beyond the sea, white trees blooming in lands long lost, shadows rising and falling like breath drawn by the world itself. When the melody faded, Gandalf stirred. "That was a song of Alqualand," he said, his voice slow with memory. "The haven of the Teleri, where the swan ships once glided on silver waves." "You remember it," said Amdir. "I was there," Gandalf replied quietly. "Not as I am now, but I remember." Halros turned his gaze to the stars. "Do you think Middle-earth itself remembers, Gandalf? Not just the elves or the books, but the land?" "Yes," Gandalf answered. "I do. The rivers carry stories. The stones keep silence, not from ignorance, but from reverence. Every tree that leans toward the west is listening." Elthain smiled faintly. "Then perhaps we honor the land not only with deeds, but with remembrance." There was a quiet agreement among them, unspoken, yet complete. Gandalf pulled from his satchel a small worn bundle wrapped in blue cloth. Slowly, he unwrapped it, revealing a piece of parchment covered in delicate, curling script. "It's a fragment," he said, passing it around. "From the journal of an elf who walked the lands of Beleriand before it was swallowed by the sea. She wrote of the stars being brighter then, of meeting a Maya in the shape of a silver fox, of a ring of stones that sang when touched by moonlight. Amdir traced the letters with reverent fingers. "This hand is Noldorin," he whispered, refined and sorrowful. Elthain leaned closer. "The silver fox, a spirit of the woods, perhaps? Or a messenger," Gandalf murmured. "Sometimes the Valar send such forms, small and quiet, yet filled with great meaning." They fell into a soft silence, watching the parchment catch the firelight, its letters flickering like the past struggling to remain seen. Later, Halros added another tale. "There's a tree in the far north, bent like a question mark. The old folk say it grew that way from grief, mourning a tower that once stood nearby. They say if you place your hand upon it and speak truth, the bark will pulse warm beneath your palm." Elthain's gaze deepened. "Truth awakening memory. That is a powerful kind of magic." "It is," Gandalf agreed. "Not of the flashy sort, but far older, the kind that reshapes mountains one grain at a time." Amdir stirred the fire gently, sending sparks swirling into the night. "We are not just travelers through these lands. We are caretakers of what they remember." He glanced at Gandalf. "And you? You have carried these stories longer than most." Gandalf smiled, not with pride, but with affection. "I only listen. The land speaks freely to those who walk slowly enough." One by one they added more fragments, a word remembered from the first tongue, a glade where deer still bow their heads before drinking, a hilltop that feels heavier beneath the moon, as though something long ago was buried deep. And as they spoke, the air itself seemed to shimmer slightly, not with magic, but with reverence. Even the stars above pulsed more clearly, brighter than before, as if listening. Finally, the fire dimmed, casting long shadows across their quiet gathering. No one moved to stir it back to life. The warmth from the stories held them more deeply than flame ever could. Gandalf stood, brushing ash from his cloak. "Tonight, we did not walk forward, but we reached far." Amdir nodded. "And the path feels clearer." With gentle farewells, no pomp, no formality, they settled into slumber or into watchful silence, each wrapped in their own thoughts. And as the moon drifted higher, the land around them sighed not with weariness, but with contentment. For tonight its stories had been heard. The night had passed, and with the coming dawn came a quiet awakening, not just of the world around them, but within the hearts of those gathered. The stars faded slowly, reluctant to leave, as if they too wished to remain beside the fire where old stories had been shared beneath their silver gaze. Gandalf rose early, as he always did. His movements were slow and thoughtful, as though the land beneath his feet guided each step. The grass was damp with dew, and the sky glowed pale gold along the horizon. Yet his eyes were not on the coming sun, but turned westward. There had been whispers in the flames the night before, tales of powers buried deep, of knowledge not yet fully understood. And now, as the last embers cooled behind him, Gandalf felt the pull of something ancient calling him forward. The others stirred quietly, sensing the shift in the wind. "It is time," Gandalf said softly, his voice not commanding but certain. "There is one place more to visit, a memory that lives not only in tale, but in stone." They did not question. Together, they gathered their belongings and moved gently through the morning hush, following Gandalf as he led them along a forgotten trail between the roots of the hills. As they walked, the land itself began to change. The trees grew taller, their trunks wide and twisted, like they had grown alongside the first stars. Moss clung thick to their roots, and the ground rose steadily beneath their feet until they reached a ridge overlooking a quiet glen. There, nestled between ancient trees, stood a stone circle, weathered, moss-covered, but still whole. The stones glowed faintly, warmed not by the sun, but by something older. "This place," Gandalf whispered, stepping inside the circle, "was built long ago by hands no longer remembered. Here, the Istari gathered before they took form and shape to walk among the free peoples. It was the last place we stood together before we stepped into time." Amdir, the elven companion, looked upon the stones with reverence. "You mean, this is where you were sent?" "Yes," Gandalf said, resting his hand on the nearest stone. "We were not born in Middle-earth. We were Maya, spirits of fire and song, before being given bodies and purpose. 5 were chosen: Kurumo, Alatar, Palando, Iwendil, and me. I was known then as Olorin." The name lingered in the air like the breath of an ancient wind. "I did not wish to come," he continued, "not out of fear, but humility. I was the least among them, or so I believed. Yet I was told by the Lady Nienna that it was precisely my gentleness that was needed, not to command, but to inspire, to walk beside, not ahead." He closed his eyes. "And so I came, not with thunder, but with kindness." The group sat in silence, each feeling the weight and peace of his words. Even the birds were still. Halros, the ranger, spoke gently. But others fell: the white wizard, Saruman, Kurumo. He turned to Pride. "Yes," Gandalf said, a hint of sorrow in his tone. "He was the wisest of us, but he forgot his purpose. Power became his aim, not service. And the 2 blue wizards, Alatar and Palando, they vanished into the east, their paths lost to shadow or silence." "And Radagast?" Elthain asked. Gandalf smiled faintly. "He loved the birds too much to care for men, but his heart was always good. Perhaps his way of healing was not through war, but through the gentle tending of life." Amdir looked into Gandalf's eyes. "And you, Olorin, you remained true." "I tried," he said quietly, "but I too faltered. I feared to confront the Balrog in Moria. I fell into shadow and died." A hush fell, but Gandalf's voice continued like a gentle breeze through the trees. "Yet I was sent back, not as I was, but as Gandalf the White, not because I was greater, but because the need was greater. It was not triumph that returned me, but purpose. I had a role to play, and it was not finished." He raised his staff slowly and tapped it once upon the stone beneath him. A faint light shimmered outward from the center of the circle, threads of silver weaving between the stones like the soft strings of a harp. The group watched, breath held, as the circle became alive with memory. Images formed, not like visions, but like impressions within the heart. A great eagle soaring over snowy peaks, a hand offering light to a frightened hobbit in the dark, a voice of comfort upon battlefields, a fire burning in defiance before the gates of Mordor. Each moment passed not with grandeur, but with grace. Gandalf lowered his staff. "That is what the Istari were meant to be," he said. "Not masters, not conquerors, but beacons, reminders that light can still shine even in the deepest night." The light faded and the circle stilled. For a long while they remained there, letting the silence soak in. The story had not ended. It had only returned to stillness. There was no need for more. Gandalf turned to them once more. "The mystery, my friends, is not what we are, but why we choose to be what we are. Power is not in fire or staff. It is in compassion, in persistence, in choosing hope when despair is easier." He looked to the west, where the hills fell away and the sky opened wide. "And though I came from Valinor," he said, "it is in Middle-earth that I found meaning." The others stood slowly, the weight of truth settling around them like a warm cloak. They had seen magic, they had heard stories, but now they understood something deeper. Gandalf had not been a hero because he was mighty, but because he remained gentle in a world that called for force. As they made their way down from the hill, the wind carried with it the last notes of a song too old for words. It was not loud. It did not seek to be heard, but it sang, nonetheless, like the memory of light in a shadowed place. And in that quiet, the mystery was no longer a puzzle to be solved. It had become a truth to be carried. And so, with the rising sun behind them and the wisdom of ages resting softly on their shoulders, they walked slowly back toward the Shire, not to end their journey, but to rest and begin again. For the road continues, my sleepy fellows, always onward, always gentle, and always lit by those who walk it with grace. The road was behind them now. The ancient stone circle had faded into the trees once more. Its whispers settled back into silence, as if only the stars had been witness to its quiet revelations. Gandalf and his companions returned not with fanfare, but with soft understanding woven into every step. No one spoke of what they had seen. There was no need. The mystery was no longer something to chase. It was something to cherish. A thread of light tucked quietly into the heart. By the time they reached the edges of the Shire, the sun had slipped beyond the hills, and dusk had painted the sky in shades of violet and silver. Smoke rose gently from hobbit chimneys, curling into the cool evening air. The world felt still, as though it too were ready to settle down and breathe slowly. Gandalf paused at the top of a gentle slope and looked down upon the fields below. Fireflies floated lazily above the tall grasses, and the scent of pipeweed and fresh-baked bread drifted on the wind. "This is what we protected," he murmured. "Not gold, not glory, but the right for this land to sleep peacefully." The others stood with him, their faces lit by the golden edge of twilight. "It is enough," Gandalf said quietly, "and it always has been." In the days that followed, they went their separate ways. Not with sorrow, but with the peace that comes when a path has been walked in fullness. Elves returned to their forests, rangers to their watchful hills. And Gandalf, well, Gandalf stayed for a little while longer. He was seen sometimes, walking the shaded lanes of the Shire, sharing a word with a passing gardener, or leaving a small light burning near a child's window when storms rolled in. He never lingered too long in one place, but wherever he went, the air seemed a little softer, the stars a little brighter. The hobbits never asked much of him. They didn't need to, for in their hearts they knew that he was part of something older and deeper than they could name. And still, he belonged with them, if only for a while. One evening, as the first leaves of autumn danced along the path, Gandalf sat alone by a small fire outside Bag End. He looked up at the stars, his pipe in hand, the smoke rising in slow spirals like stories drifting upward into the night. "There's still much to wonder," he said softly, as though to the moon, "but that, too, is a kind of peace." He smiled then, a quiet, knowing smile that wrapped the world in warmth. And in the hush that followed, as the fire crackled low and the stars shimmered gently above, the story settled like a blanket over the hills. So sleep now, my dear sleepy fellows. Let your mind drift through the forests and fields of Middle-earth, where rivers murmur secrets and old trees whisper lullabies. Carry the light of Gandalf's kindness with you into the dreamscape, where magic is never loud, but always near, and courage is quiet, but unbreakable. May your rest be deep, your heart be calm, and your spirit ever drawn toward the gentle roads of wonder. Good night, and may peace watch over you until the morning comes.